Okay, I'm glad that that worked for everybody. Super happy about that. So we can continue and make the first steps with regards to Entity Framework. For that, we first need to install a so-called global tool for .NET. Let's do that. Please open a shell, CMD, whatever you use, depending on your operating system. And let's try to run .NET. We know that .NET should be installed on all your machines because we have been doing .NET for quite a while now. And what we are going to do now is we are going to install the .NET Entity Framework tooling. And that works like that. You simply say .NET tool install -- global .NET-EF, like Entity Framework. Let's run it. This will hopefully fetch the .NET Entity Framework tooling and install it locally on your machine. In my case, it says tool .NET-EF was successfully installed. I will copy this command and give it to you through Discord, so you do not need to type it in. I also pasted in a link to a documentation article which says getting started with EFCore. So whatever I'm going to show you in the upcoming, hour and tomorrow, you can always take a look. You can always revisit these informations by going to this link. As I said, it's called Getting Started with EFCore. You do not need to take a look at this documentation article now because you have me. But later on, when you are at home alone and you would like to try something, revisit that article. Now we install the .NET tooling and we can try that by simply saying .NET-EF. And we will see the beautiful logo of Entity Framework. It's a unicorn. And if it works, if it prints something like this, I'm super happy. And we can get started in programming. You will definitely need the tooling, the .NET-EF. So make sure to remember to install that. If it happens that you have an old version of this tooling installed, you can always update the tooling. You do that by saying .NET tool update -- global .NET-EF. So before we had install and now we have update. We can run it. And you said, yeah, and the system tells me that .NET-EF was reinstalled with the latest stable version. If it happens that at one point in time you would like to have a preview version, maybe for .NET 8 or something like this, you can use -- version and then add the version number at the end. So if you have a documentation article on the internet that says this great new feature of Entity Framework that you absolutely would like to have is available in Entity Framework preview whatever version, then with this flag you can install preview versions, okay? Very nice. Good. Now that we have SQL Server installed, we have the Data Studio installed, we have .NET installed, we have the .NET Entity Framework tooling installed, we are ready to go. We can now write our first lines of code regarding Entity Framework. And this is exactly what we are going to do. So please, wherever you want, create a directory for our first Entity Framework exercise. I will call it Hello EF. You can call it whatever you want. And inside of this Hello EF, please say .NET new web in order to create a web API. And then open this thing up in Visual Studio Code. I think I can use the dark theme here because we are on the TV and not on a video beamer. Good. I will make it a little bit larger. Good. We are good. Now, in order to work with Entity Framework Core, we need at least 2 NuGet packages. So please start the NuGet Package Manager GUI. We talked about this Package Manager GUI multiple times. I hope so far in the course you have already installed it. Please go to Install New Package, and where it wants you to enter the package name, you enter Microsoft.Entity Framework Core, and then click Search. Then you have to wait for a moment. And if I scroll down a little bit, we see, for instance, here, Microsoft Entity Framework SQL Server, Microsoft Entity Framework in memory, Microsoft SQL Server Core SQLite. And there are more and more and more NuGet packages. Some databases are supported directly by Microsoft, and some databases are supported by third-party vendors. Here in the documentation, in the Entity Framework documentation, you see a list of NuGet packages with the supported database engines. You have SQL Server, SQLite, in-memory database, Cosmos DB, Postgres, MySQL DB, MariaDB, Oracle. What else do we have? DB2, Informix, Firebird, Teradata. Oh, a lot. Simply a lot. Okay? For our purposes, we need the Entity Framework Core .SQL Server. Here it is, Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server. I'm going to install that one. Please do so. That's the first one. Obviously, if you don't work with SQL Server, but you work with SQLite, you would use a different NuGet package. And if you work with DB2, you would use a different NuGet package. I think you get the idea, right? Good. It is definitely possible to write .NET and Entity Framework applications that are completely database independent. That's absolutely possible. So you can write code once, and then let your customers decide whether they want to work with Oracle, with DB2, with SQL Server, with SQLite, or whatever. But that's a little bit harder, and we will not cover that topic in this course. But it's absolutely possible. The second NuGet package that we need is called Design at the end. Microsoft Entity Framework Core .design. I hope that the Wi-Fi does what it's supposed to do. Okay, not for me. Maybe I have to switch to the wired connection again. Let me try again. So I'm going to use Entity Framework Design again. Let's see. Come on. Yeah, here it is. This is the second NuGet package that we need. This one. This Entity Framework Design NuGet package is just used for development purposes. So it offers us a few very useful features for us as developers. At runtime, we don't need this package. So if you take a look at the CS_proj file here, then you see that we have these two packages. See? And they are necessary for what we want to do. So remember that. In the next exam, you will definitely need to add these two NuGet packages. And you will definitely also need to add these two NuGet packages during your final exam, during your Matura next year. Yep. Not very complicated. Nice. Now that we have our NuGet packages, we can start working with the database. And working with the database is a multi-step process. The first step is usually creating the model. Model means that you create classes which reflect your data structure. Here in this school, we use a technique in Entity Framework which is called code first. That means that we do not create the database tables in the database and then map to our classes, but we simply create classes and the entity framework tooling will create the tables based on our classes for us. So we never ever have to remember things like create table, alter table, and things like that. That's completely covered by entity framework for us. We simply create a bunch of classes and we are good. Good? Good. So what would you like to store? I think I would like to store pets, animals, pets. So let's create a class. Let's call it pet. And inside of the class pet, let's add a property of type integer with the name ID. Let's add a second property of type string with name, pet name. And let's add another property int of type cuteness. Sounds good? I think that's fine. The pet name, I will define that the pet name is by default just empty. So I get rid of these warnings. I think that is okay. See, very, very simple class here. Let me tell you a little bit about this data modeling here. It's important to understand that with Entity Framework Core, naming matters. In our case, it's extremely important that this property is called ID. Because it's called ID, Entity Framework Core will automatically create a primary key on this column, and it will also automatically fill this column with a primary key assigned by the database. If you would call it, I don't know, pet identifier, it wouldn't work. Of course, it is possible to tell Entity Framework that although it's called pet identifier, it should be the primary key, and I will tell you more about that tomorrow. But for now, just trust me when I tell you it's a good idea to follow the so-called conventions of Entity Framework, because that's super useful. It makes it much easier to set up the database. For now, it's perfectly fine. We just want to have a kind of hello world for Entity Framework. So I'm super happy with exactly that model. Next, we are going to create the so-called database context. The pet context, for instance, and the class pet context has to derive from DB context. It has to derive from DB context. Now, for DB context, you have to add a using statement using Microsoft Entity Framework Core. Just use the light bulb, press enter, and you have the necessary using statement up here. See it? Not very difficult. Inside of the pet context, we have to add a little bit of stuff in order to make it work. The first one is a constructor. The constructor, public pet context, gets one parameter, and don't worry, all these things are noted in the documentation from Microsoft, and you can always go back to this very simple example to remember what we just do. It's not a lot of code. The pet context constructor gets one parameter, which is called DB context options. Okay, we have to write it out. DB context options. Here it is. And the type parameter here is the pet context. This is how you write it. And then you simply say options, because these are the options. And you pass on these options to the base class. You don't have to do anything with these options, and that's it. Everything else is provided by Entity Framework. This is really a very simple cooking recipe. You can simply copy this constructor and you are good. The only thing that you have to rename is the name of the context. Last but not least, we have to tell Entity Framework that we want to store a table of these pets here. So what we are going to do is we're going to say public DB context, sorry, DB set, of course, of pets equals to db set. Sorry, you create the database set and you simply say set of, set of pet. This is what you want to do. Probably you will need a using statement here. No, doesn't work. Why? Obviously, sorry, here. It should be a lambda expression. This is the correct one. See? It should be a lambda expression. This single line tells Entity Framework that in our database we want to have a single table that is called pets, and we want to store instances of this class. So it will generate the necessary columns automatically. We do not need to create the table or whatever you want to have. We simply create the DB set here and we are good. Now that's essentially all we need to do. The last thing that we need to do is to tell ASP.NET Core about our database. This is exactly what we are going to do now. With dependency injection here after the builder, we simply say builder.services.addDBContexts, this one. And here we say we want to use the pet contexts. Let's get options, and then we say here options use SQL Server, and here in the parameters of use SQL Server we have to specify a connection string. We have to tell the system where the database lives. Okay? So we have to get a connection string. In this hello world example, we will hard code the connection string directly here inside of this code. But tomorrow we are going to get rid of this. We are going to make it better. We are going to put this connection string into a config file because we want to make it exchangeable. But for now, for today, hello world, let's make it very, very simple. So what do you have to specify here? Use first server equals to, and then it depends where your server runs. If you run everything in Docker, you can simply say localhost. If you work with localDB, you say localDB in parentheses / / MS SQL localDB. Can you remember? This is exactly what we specified in the Azure Data Studio. Let's add a semicolon. Next one is the database. Let's add the database name pets. And now things are different between Docker and localDB. If you are on Docker, you have to specify the user SA and the password, whatever you chose. If you are on localDB, you simply say trusted connection equals true. It will take your Windows user and pass the Windows user onto localDB and everything is good. Okay? Good. Now let's try to build everything. .NET build. Let's see if you have any mistakes. In my case, hopefully I'm good. Yes, build succeeded. 0 warnings, 0 errors. Does everybody see 0 warnings, 0 errors? Anybody having problems? Yeah, now comes the hour of truth. We now have to issue 2 statements, 2 command line statements. So please open a terminal window inside of your Visual Studio Code where you are directly in your program. I will not go into the details of what we are going to do now. Just trust me, follow me, and tomorrow we have time enough to go into all the details. Okay? For today, We are just saying hello to Entity Framework. I know I will not talk about everything, but we will do that, don't worry. .NET EF migrations add, and then give it a name. For instance, something like initial. You can call it Hansi if you want. I really don't care. It's just a name. Then you press enter, and then we see whether you worked correctly, whether I worked correctly. Done. This is a good thing. If it says building started, building succeeded, done, then you're good. Let me quickly tell you what happened behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, you got a new folder inside of your project. You see it here, and it's called migrations. If you don't know what migrations are, no problem at all. I will tell you more about that tomorrow. Last but not least, if you were able to follow that far, one thing is missing. .NET EF database update. .NET EF database update. Let's see. Boom. Oh yeah, I made a horrible mistake, a stupid mistake. I used LocalDB because I wanted to show you how it works on Windows. But currently, my .NET application doesn't run on Windows. I use the Windows subsystem for Linux. So now I'm using .NET on Linux to access LocalDB on Windows, and that doesn't work. Sorry, my bad. No problem at all. All I have to do is switch the connection string. So instead of LocalDB MS SQL DB, in your case it should work if you have LocalDB. I'm switching to localhost. I'm saying username is SA, and the password is this strange password that I think I still have in my keyboard ring. Yeah, okay. And I will run it again. .NET EF database update. Let's see. Build started. Build succeeded. And still, it doesn't work. Let's see. I have to check the... Okay, the problem is the certificate, because we don't have a trusted certificate, but we can add a setting, trust server certificate equals true. That means that we simply trust the certificate. Let's try it again. That is just because we are in a development environment. If we would work in a production environment, it would be hopefully much better. But still, yeah, of course, I made another mistake. I have still the trusted connection equals true here in my connection string. That's obviously wrong. And hopefully, it now works. Now I think you have seen all the... Yes, it finally worked. Now you have seen all the things that can go wrong. So now I have it running on Linux using a Docker container on Linux. And just to prove the point, and then I will take time and help you overcome any potential problem. Just to prove the point, I can use Azure Data Studio, refresh the list of databases here. Ah, yeah, that's the wrong one. Here it is. Pets, see? Pets. And if I take a look at the tables, we have the pets table. And if you take a look at the pets table in the column, we see ID, pet name, and cuteness. And that is exactly what I wanted. We said hello from Entity Framework Core to the SQL Server database, and that was my goal for today's lesson. So to set everything up and to have a quick walkthrough from 0 to Entity Framework at SQL Server. So now I will take time and make sure that it works on all your machines. Okay? I have recorded everything, so if you want to rerun things on your own computer at home, you will be able to do based on the video recording.